Hello there! Time for a new video. This video, since it's on the 4th, I figured should be on a topic very close to a lot of Americans' hearts. It's on natural rights. Now, for those who don't know what natural rights are, the principle behind natural rights comes from the Enlightenment. It's actually where the relationship becomes between our independence and this concept. You see, when our founders were thinking of independence, or even just having a different spot in the monarchy with some minor representation and a bit more autonomy, they were thinking with the Enlightenment as the backdrop. The Enlightenment being a movement during this time led by Rousseau, Hobbes, and Locke. In particular, Hobbes and Locke were very influential on the English for the matter of the Enlightenment. Rousseau was more French, so fun times, but the idea of natural rights came up because one big question all of them were asking was, in a state of nature, so a state without other people, society, or anything like that, what did a person have naturally, innately? Essentially, these would be what you would call your God-given rights, or just the rights you have for existing. Now, you could justify this with the divine, like a lot of classical liberals did at the time, or you could just say, well, it's what we have when we're on our own, so we should have it when we are in society as well to protect our independence and our autonomy. But, regardless, it's important to discuss. So these rights are essentially what you have absent other intervention. And these rights include bearing arms, living, private property, expression, worship, and I'm sure there are a few others that I'm missing, but these are the basics. Now you might notice a few things. Number one, most of these are in our Constitution, and there's a reason for that. You see, when the Constitution was being written, the initial question was, well, shouldn't our people be guaranteed rights? And a lot of people agreed, because they were worried about a tyrannical government. So, they proposed the Bill of Rights as an addendum to the initial Constitution, and of these, such were included. Now remember, natural rights are built on the precipice of independence. So, if you are a person, and you have no society around you, no other interaction, what do you just have? And naturally, that means things like, for example, the right to an attorney or food are not natural rights, because you do not just have a right to food. Food must be produced by you or someone else first, and so you don't just have a right to it. Same with healthcare. Someone has to perform that action of taking care of your health in order to have it exist at all. As a result, these rights are innate, and they can lead to certain conclusions. For example, if the self is viewed as property, then private property rights would mean that a person has ownership of themselves. This was one of the very first things that especially economists latched onto. For example, one of the big things for the Wealth of Nations was this idea of self-ownership. When they were considering the matter of private property, they effectively agreed that the person owns themselves. Thus, they have control over what happens to themselves and autonomy from that. Simultaneously, the right to bear arms means the ability to defend oneself. This is combined with the right to life. Now, the defense of property comes from the right to private property and the right to bear arms. All of these feed on each other because they're based in the same principles. If you were, as a person, alone in the forest, and you had a gun with you, not only would you just be allowed to have the gun because no one's there to stop you, but also you would have the right to defend yourself and your property. It could be food, water, your hand, this pen, whatever you had on you. You have the right to defend yourself and that property from anything that comes. It could be wolves, a bear, a fish. I don't know why a fish would attack you, but you would have the right to defend yourself from it. And so The right to self-defense necessitates the right to bear a weapon. Arms are the most advanced, and so they naturally come with it. So, as a result, people, naturally, have the right to bear arms. They have the right to life, property, expression, and worship. Another way of saying this would be the famous phrase, life, liberty, and property. Essentially, you have the right to life, you have the right to your own personal liberties, and you have the right to own and protect property. And this is very important when anyone's making rules or regulations. Because, and I'll let out my own biases here, natural rights are something that must be protected. For one, it's just a simple fact. You cannot repress these easily. The reason why is quite simple. They are natural rights. If you were to, say, try to take someone's life, that person would have the ability to fight back. It does not matter if it's illegal to fight back, they still can. And so if they can defend themselves, then there's a good chance you will be the one to lose your life that day. Simultaneously, you try to take someone's private property. What's going to happen? They're just going to pick something else from the commons and claim it as their own. You can't stop private property from happening because so long as people can just grab things and say this is mine and claim ownership, there's going to be private property. Say the freedom of expression. Ban the press all you want. Someone's still going to talk behind closed doors. You could also try banning worship of a certain religion. For example, you could say we should ban Christianity because Christians are too bad and all the Catholic priests and touching kids. Which, fun fact, teachers actually have a higher rate of doing that. So, Or you could say ban Islam because their religion is associated with a number of murders and they are, well, not exactly well liked by many Christians. And you could try. Would you succeed? No, you would fail miserably. Doesn't matter if it's Christianity, Islam, or any other religion, it's hard to ban worship because faith is something in your head. You cannot just stop someone believing. Unless you convince them that their faith is wrong, you are not going to convince a person, okay, I'm going to change my faith now. You don't just fix someone's faith by banning it. You can't do that. And what about bearing arms? Surely we can restrict that, especially if we have a database. No, especially not anymore with 3D printers as an ability. So long as someone can own a 3D printer, it is very possible to get a schematic, especially on the internet, print out a gun, it could even fire one bullet, doesn't matter, it could still do a lot of damage, and use it. Also, it should be noted, the Unabomber actually made his own gun in a shack with spare parts. So it is not impossible for a person, if they're committed enough, to do so. There's also the black market, which is something outside of government regulation. So needless to say, there will always be access for criminals to have guns. For example, the Japanese Yakuza also have firearms. It's just that they, generally speaking, are sort of ignored by larger society, mainly because there are bigger issues at hand in Japan, mostly society breaking down, and their debt being, just casual $6 trillion. But back to the main point, you cannot really restrict these rights short of, destroying everything in your path. Unless you put every single person in the dirt, people will be able to do these things, especially this one. So long as a person can choose to live or not, they can fight for the right to life, and it's not easy to take that away. Now one might ask, well, what about the death penalty? In such a case, there is an argument for restricting natural rights, and the only argument is the matter of hand and face. Now one might ask, what's this a reference to? Well, it's a reference to a phrase where a person will say, your rights extend from your hand until it touches my face, or something along those lines. Essentially, your rights end where another's begin. Meaning, your body's rights and autonomy end at someone else's. If I can consent to, say, drinking this soda, then you cannot stop me, because my right to do so is not infringing on yours. However, if I went and tried to force you to drink it, then absolutely I would not only be in the wrong, but I would be violating your rights. Because you have the right to say yes to drinking the soda and no. You have both. However, if I try to restrict your rights, then I have violated them. And this gets into the idea of the social contract. Now, I don't fully agree with social contract theory because you can't exactly agree or disagree when it's just what's around you. But, fundamentally, when we are born, we have these natural rights because no one can stop us. That's the whole point. You cannot violate someone's natural rights and expect it to be, well, a good thing. You have these rights, and so does everyone else, and so your rights end where theirs begin. As a result, someone who violates these rights is effectively breaking a contract with nature itself. Could be the creator if you're going by religious justification, or just, well, life. Still requires some level of spiritual justification, but it's still there. And as a result, you cannot, let me rephrase, you can argue that the death penalty is merely a punishment for a violation of natural rights. For example, murder. If I kill someone, I have violated someone else's right to life. How does a contract work when one side breaks it? Oh, right. The contract is void and the other side, simultaneously, is either forced to abandon all gains from the contract or pay restitution for the loss. Oftentimes it can be both, and if it's an exact cash figure, that's usually the expected amount. Well, in the case where the cash figure would be a human life, how do you pay off the debt of a life? Well, with another life. You kill them. And so there's a very real justification for that. But the big thing here is, of course, when it comes down to it, I can make that argument and I would still be perfectly within the idea of natural rights. A person who instead says, I should restrict your right to bear arms because it interferes with the right to life, is violating this contract because they are making the aggressive act. The violator is the aggressor. If I declare that something is an aggressive act, that does not make it an aggressive act. However, if I engage in an action which directly impedes someone else or harms them without them doing something first to justify such a response, then I have acted as an aggressor. Aggression is merely defined by who throws the first punch. For example, in Vietnam, the North invaded the South. They threw the first punch, so they are the aggressor. You could use the same with Iraq. The United States were the first to invade Iraq, therefore they are the aggressor in that situation. Depending on the situation, being the aggressor isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does have negative connotations, and more importantly, it removes you from any justification of, well, I'm trying to defend. Because you're not. You are on the assault. You're not defending anything. You are moving forwards, trying to advance a cause. If you restrict the right to bear arms, not only will it not work, and as a matter of fact, even if it does, there are other weapons to use. For example, ask London with their knife crime. But also, and this is an important thing, you are basically arguing violation of rights, and thus breaking the contract to protect the contract. You are aggressing in the name of defense. It doesn't make any sense. And fundamentally, it's not a proper way of handling a situation. If you were to argue, I want to be aggressive to secure a position and then act in defense of that position, that's one thing. But this is not acting in defense. It's pure aggression with a defensive justification. I don't think I should point this out, but the Roman justification of expansionist defense is not something that we should keep going with. It makes no sense, and it's wildly impractical. If you want to be aggressive, just freaking say it. I mean, I'll say it. Invade Mexico. Invade France. There you go. Aggression. And another thing to note is, a lot of these have implications for society. For example, when you have a society where you're allowed your natural rights, you will naturally see people, one, be more trusting because they know their rights will be protected, but also, you'll notice it's a lot cheaper for the simple fact that you don't have to pay for the enforcement of bans on these things. Unlike human rights, which I'll get to later, natural rights are completely free to just happen. It does not cost anything to allow a person to say you're an idiot. It does not cost anything to allow a person to pray in a square. Nor does it cost anything to allow a person to live or to own a gun. The person themselves picks up the burdens that come from that decision and pays it themselves. The society does not pay a thing to allow this. Now you might say, especially with the bear arms thing, well, we pay with dead kids or dead lives. Small problem. You're not paying for the right to bear arms. You are paying for allowing idiots to exist. And there's a simple solution. It's called a bullet. But, regardless, you're not actually paying for the right itself, but rather you are paying for something else and then blaming the right for why it happens. And I will defend this to the death. Natural rights are necessary in a society. In order for a society to work, you must necessarily allow people to be free. If you decide that you can, by diktat, rule on what people are and are not allowed to do, you can effectively rule as a tyrant. And the issue comes from who do you put in charge. For example, I am more conservative, so I prefer Trump over Kamala. Now, that being said, would I argue that we can get rid of all gun rights while Trump is president? No, absolutely freaking not. What about Kamala? Oh, no, then. If you want to argue that a right can be taken away, private property, expression, worship, arms, or life, if one of those rights can be taken away just because the government feels like it, what's to stop a government of the opposite side, or the side that opposes you, taking control and using that to repress you, or be tyrannical over you? Nothing. If the state can decide what is right and what is wrong, then the state can dictate your life for you. Should that happen? Frankly, I would say no, for a simple fact of, if the government's allowed to do that, the government can kill you, find a woodshed, and you can do jack all. Why would it make any sense to allow such a thing? That's stupid. It doesn't work. And it's just going to result in bodies after bodies being piled into the corner while the government says, we are moral, we know what you need, and therefore we shall decide it for you. Even as an authoritarian, that's pushing it. That's totalitarian levels of the state is God. It's ridiculous. But, hey, you're welcome to your stupid opinions. As a matter of fact, that's part of expression. If I could, for example, censor all of my opponents, I wouldn't. Because I disagree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Because it makes no sense to have rules for thee and not for me. When it comes to natural rights, that is something we all inherently have. There is no argument, there is no debate. It is inherent. Because it's what we have when we're alone. When I'm in the woods, in the commons, no person around, I have these rights. I could, for example, start praying to a tree. Would I? Probably not unless I go crazy, but I can. I'd have the right to call everyone around me a word I'm not going to say because I think it's rude. I could pick up a stick and claim it is the holy stick that I own. I could live until a lion decides it doesn't like me. And if I had a gun, I'd be able to have it and use it. Fundamentally, I have natural rights at any point when I'm alone. When I transition to a social setting, that does not change. I do not suddenly shed my rights upon entering your society. Rather, I say, I still have my rights, but I won't violate yours. It is a handshake agreement, a contract of mutual understanding where I say, I have my rights, you have yours, therefore we shall not interfere. And once interference does happen, someone must get punished for interfering. If they do not get punished, then that is a failure of society and should be fixed. Otherwise, well, there's always vigilante justice, but I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, if someone can just say, you killed my brother, and put someone in the dirt, that just end very poorly. We need rule of law, 100%. But in order to have rule of law be effective, we must have natural rights. For otherwise, we are deciding for tyranny to rule. And it's also worth noting, there are many more implications for natural rights than just self-ownership and the right to defend oneself and their property. I'm sure you can think of many, and I will likely go into depth on more. But those implications carry. They carry great weight and are very important, and should not just be left to be forgotten. If one says, oh, well, I have the right to life, therefore that only impacts my ability to just breathe and drink and eat, then they are effectively saying, yeah, I understand 2 plus 2 is an equation, but I don't know what it equals. You're not taking it to its logical conclusion. If 2 plus 2 equals A, and you just leave it at that and say, oh, well, just 2 plus 2 equals A, that's all that matters, well, then you would be ignoring the obvious fact that A equals 4. You gotta keep in mind what things mean and how they result in different outcomes. That is just reality. We should not ignore them. Anyways, that'll be all for this video. I'll make another in about a few minutes. And so, have a good one. Goodbye.